All right, let's read from Matthew 19, verses 13 to 15. Then people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." And when he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there. It's interesting to think about, but even though you don't notice it when the first time you read them, that most children's stories actually have themes or messages that would be considered pretty heavy for children. But it isn't the types of themes or messages you would think that would be in a children's book, or at least ones that you think would be or at least ones that nobody would actually consider putting in a children's book. I mean, sure, there are some books that are definitely written for children, like Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham or any of his other books. But there are also some that seem to be geared toward an older audience, or at least have themes that should be mostly for adults or such, like the Black Cauldron. While the writing style of these children's books may be simplistic and the plot a bit straightforward, and let's agree on that, that doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of the story that aren't really geared towards an older audience, or that they aren't considered to be very heavy for like a children's book. I mean, you also see this in cartoons and comic books as well. I mean, just because people like to assume that cartoons and comic books are for kids doesn't mean that it doesn't also contain heavy topics. Well, of course, there are some cartoons and comics that are meant for like high schoolers and adults, like Full Metal Alchemist. That one's definitely not for kids. But some of the older cartoons and comics that are considered to be for kids, like Static Shock, do actually contain episodes with like heavy themes like racism and gun violence and dealing with the loss of a parent. Now, you can consider this to be like a comment on TV and book rating systems, as long as as long as you like contain to these guidelines, you can pretty much add other stuff as long as you're not like too like obvious about it. But is that the only reason for why these themes are also portrayed in these types of medias? Another reason is that because these types of themes, while heavy and sometimes dark, help kids improve their understanding of the world, while also using it in a way that they can understand it while not losing the seriousness of the topic. Sure, I mean, at first glance, they're not going to understand it at first. I mean, but that doesn't mean that they won't see it later in life. And let's be honest, most people don't understand things when they are first exposed to the topic, nor are they able to see that this is what their show, comic, or book were mentioning, especially at a young age. I mean, even adults have a hard time noticing that at first, regardless if it's a children's book or a classic literature. This is because of the fact that we often let ourselves be clouded by our own expectations, and in some cases, how others perceive these forms of media, without actually taking the time to look between the lines, so to speak. In fact, you can even say the same thing about the passage that we have read in Matthew 19. Odds are, when you have read this passage for the first time, you just thought that this referred to the fact that children should learn about the Bible, or that parents should at least be willing to talk about the teachings of Jesus Christ to their children. I mean, can't argue with that. I mean, it makes sense to think that way, especially since Jesus does tell them to let the children come to him. And one can even use this verse as an argument for the importance of Sunday school and why it's important for youth to learn about the Bible. And not only that, but this type of verse will be one that is considered prevalent in the modern age, since there are schools that are being prevented to even mention or reference religion to their students. While the importance of youth learning the gospel is an important aspect of this verse, that isn't the only thing that we should focus on when we read this text. First, we have to look at what happens within the text before Jesus tells his disciples to let the children come to him. We see that this event happens when Jesus was healing and teaching in a region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And this happens right after he finishes teaching about divorce, that the parents have started to bring their children to Jesus so that he may bless them and pray for them. We see that the disciples start to rebuke them because of this. Whether the disciples were rebuking the parents, the children, or just the crowd in general for allowing this to happen, we basically see that the disciples didn't like what was happening. They mostly likely thought it would be wrong to bother Jesus with this type of thing, having children come to him to be blessed and prayed for, due to the large number of crowds that Jesus taught and healed that day. Odds are, most of us would probably agree that with the disciples' reaction to this, especially those who have any experience teaching or taking care of children. I mean, children can be loud and messy from time to time, regardless of their age, and which can cause people to feel overwhelmed after a certain amount of time, especially if you've been doing something else also at that same time. Not only that, but since Jesus was teaching about divorce before this happened, the kids would definitely have not, at least I hope, would not have understood what Jesus was teaching when they were there. By that logic, the disciples thought that they were right to rebuke the people for this, since they believed that Jesus' time was too valuable to spend on children who wouldn't understand what he was talking about in the first place. Basically, they assumed that the children were a distraction that prevented Jesus from being able to properly do what he came to do, or at least what they thought Jesus came to do, which is why they were essentially annoyed by them and were rebuking people, telling them to not bring their children to Jesus. Yet we see that this isn't the case, since Jesus tells them to not rebuke the people for bringing their children to him. In fact, in Mark 10:13-16, which also records this event, also mentions that Jesus was actually indignant at the disciples for how they were behaving. He was actually mad at them for acting this way. You would consider this a strange response to how they were acting, since many would probably agree that children are distracting and that, let's be honest, all of us would probably feel a little awkward to ask, bring your children to someone as great as Jesus to be prayed and blessed for, especially after hearing such a heavy topic. I mean, there's this bit of awkwardness that one would feel about bringing their kids to Jesus, even though that that this might be a good thing for them. And because of this, the disciples probably thought that they would be probably commended for their response, but instead, the opposite actually happens. Jesus pretty much shows them that they were wrong to disapprove of what has happened, and instead encourages people to bring their children to him so he can bless and pray for them. While it may not seem obvious when we read this passage, there are actually two topics it teaches besides the fact that children should be taught the Bible, or that we should at least be willing to encourage children to read the Bible and to learn about the Bible. It shows us the importance of humility and the desire to want a person to come to Christ, and especially to God. Now, I admit there are some verses that would be a better example of these two topics, but that doesn't mean that this passage doesn't also show it as well. In fact, one could say that this passage acts as an example of these two topics being shown by Jesus. First, let's talk about the importance of humility that is being shown within the passage. When reading this passage with the concept of humility in mind, the phrase "pride comes before a fall" comes in mind. There's a chance you might have heard references to this type of phrase before. I mean, it can be also considered an abbreviation of what King Solomon says in Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It pretty much means that if you are too arrogant or overconfident in your abilities, you'll end up in a situation that will change your own opinion of yourself. Basically, it's a quote that warns against arrogance and encourages the use of humility in your life, because if you're too arrogant, you'll basically end up in a situation that shows that you're wrong, similar to what happened to the disciples in this passage. And most likely people shorten it to "pride comes before a fall" because it'll be easier to remember, while also implying the same message as the original quote, similar to how children's stories would have heavy topics but also simplify how the wording so they can understand it. While it may be hard to see sometimes due to our society's interest in self-promotion, especially with the large number of social media apps one can use to essentially show off to people, humility is still a trait that people still value. I mean, even psychologists and researchers have stated that humility improves a person's ability to lead, learn, and interact with other people. And it is also useful for improving one's mental health due to its ability to reduce anxiety and promote self-awareness. But at the same time, humility is a trait that people have difficulty putting into practice throughout their life. It's true that people do agree that humility is an important trait to have. There's no argument about that. But often they have a difficult time actually really applying that trait in their life. One can even say that people are more likely to act humble in certain situations, specifically ones that give them an advantage in some way. It also doesn't help that concepts like humble bragging are considered to be acceptable in society. Basically, best way to understand this, people have a tendency to act humble due to the fact that it makes it easier for them to get what they want, or because it is easier for them to get people to think highly of them. They don't understand that humility isn't something that you can turn on and off whenever you want, but that is something that should be practiced throughout one's life, something that should be continually used. Otherwise, it wouldn't be much of a trait for a person to have, or even value in the first place, if you can just use it situationally. Now, within the context of the passage, we see that Jesus is humbling his disciples by showing them that their behavior is an incorrect reaction to what was happening. Sure, children can be distracting, that is true, and may be difficult to teach at times, but that doesn't mean that they should be ignored when it comes to spreading the gospel. I mean, if you go by that logic, Jesus should have stuck with the Pharisees and other high-class members of the Jewish community during his earthly ministry instead of preaching to the people that he did preach, sinners and Gentiles. I mean, the Pharisees and other people of the Jewish community were the ones that had the training and the knowledge, so it would have been easier, essentially, for Jesus to teach them and to help them understand, and at the same time, wouldn't make a lot of sense for Jesus to just spend time talking to sinners and Gentiles because they wouldn't understand what he was talking about or have no clue what he was referencing to. Yet, Jesus not only taught and healed them, but also spent time with them to show that they still matter to God. While other believers at the time may have considered them to be lost causes, I mean, due to the society and what they're raised in, I mean, it's kind of hard not to think that way. Jesus shows them that they still are able to return to God and that God still wants them, and that he didn't abandon them, and that there aren't lost causes. Which then leads to the next point this passage shows us, the importance of wanting others to come to God. While the disciples did have an idea that they should want people to come to God, there are also still parts of them that believe that Jesus should only focus on certain types of people during his ministry. Basically, people who are able to do something after they receive Jesus' teachings, like they can actually learn from it and grow from it. This mostly stems from the fact that the disciples believed that Jesus would literally deliver Israel from the Roman Empire and establish a literal kingdom on earth for them, which is why they thought there was really no point in Jesus teaching children, at least right now, maybe later after the kingdom was established. I mean, but again, with this type of mindset, if you think about it, with this type of mindset, it would make sense for why the apostles would want Jesus to teach people who would be able to help with essentially kickstart Israel's deliverance from the Roman Empire, gather all the people and get them out of Rome and then start up the new kingdom. But again, by that logic, it would have made no sense for Jesus to have chosen the disciples that he has chosen in the first place if Jesus' goal was to establish a literal kingdom on earth. Maybe one or two of them possibly, but again, it would have been, like I mentioned before, it would have made more sense for Jesus to stick with the Pharisees and the other high-class members of the Jewish community during his earthly ministry if his actual goal was to actually start a literal kingdom on earth in the first place. I mean, these types of people would have been the ones that had the power and the financial backing and able to reach a lot of people at the time that one would need in order to start basically a mini rebellion to get away from the Roman Empire and start a little kingdom. Sure, you may have like one or two common people to like get the commoner support, but at the same time, those guys would also be like highly respected people as well. But instead, Jesus called people that would have been considered working class citizens to be his disciples. Not only that, but we even see that Matthew was a tax collector, and they were considered to be essentially as bad as sinners or even worse during that time. It's like similar to like if you mention a group of athletes and then you point out Olympians, you know that those guys are the best of the best. In this case, tax collectors were often pointed at because they were the worst of the worst to the Jewish community and the people at the time. I mean, that's why the Bible passages specifically point out that whenever Jesus was eating with sinners, he was also eating with tax collectors because they were considered to be the worst of the worst in people's minds. And basically, the disciples were types of people nobody would have bothered with at the time, especially on spiritual matters. Yet, they were still the ones that Jesus chose as his disciples. He didn't really look at their status. It wasn't because they were great speakers or they had a lot of public relations. He chose them because that's who he wanted to choose. Jesus is showing us that while it may not seem like we are doing much when it comes to teaching children or even certain adults the gospel, that doesn't mean we should simply ignore them and go for like an easy option, like someone who's been raised in a Christian home or someone who's actually had the education and just teach them. In fact, we should instead want people to come to God regardless of whether they fit our idea of what a Christian should be like or whether they had any prior knowledge to begin with. I mean, let's be honest, most of our reasoning for why we don't want certain people to either go to God or become a Christian is often petty and biased. And not only that, but again, if we go by our petty and biased reasoning, then nobody will be able to go to God in the first place, not even ourselves, because we still have flaws that other people can see within us. Jesus is showing us that the only reasoning that a Christian should be a Christian is that they are willing to go to God and live their lives for him. That is the main and primary concern. Sure, it may take some time for the message to take root in their hearts, and it may be difficult at times. You know, they might understand one aspect, but not all others, or they have an idea, but they aren't able to properly implement it in their lives. But it is something that we should still desire because it is what God desires. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't people we should be cautious about or people that will try to take advantage of a Christian's forgiving nature. Unfortunately, there will be encounters with those types of people throughout your life. But that doesn't mean you should be so eager or to cut them out or simply think of them as lost causes or that your first reaction should be to just ignore them. Again, otherwise, there is no point of us or any of us to go to God if that's the case, since we are basically all lost causes before Jesus had sacrificed his life for us. It's only when they don't show any real effort or desire to change from their simple ways that we have to unfortunately stop trying to help them understand. While it is true that we should want to help them and still try to help them, the people that we try to help still have to make the effort to want to change and go to God. And not only that, but we also have to remember that we aren't the ones that actually change hearts. God is the one who does it. We're just simply the people that he uses, the way he uses us. And sure, maybe what we say at first doesn't affect them. Maybe someone else could help them, or maybe it will just take some time. But at the same time, we shouldn't feel disheartened when we don't see immediate results. And this is why it leads back to why it is important for us to have humility in the first place. We never earned or deserved the gift of salvation in the first place, nor do we have the ability to change people's hearts. In fact, the only thing we truly deserve is the wrath of God. But Jesus paid for our sinful nature and made it possible for us to be able to go to God and be able to truly honor and worship him throughout our life. Jesus is the reason for why we can proclaim ourselves as children of God and are able to spread the good news to other people. So with that in mind, why are there times when it feels like we're obsessively gatekeeping Christianity? Basically, why do we waste time preventing people from coming to God in the first place? The problem people have when it comes to spreading the gospel is that they forget that salvation was given to them, even though they never earned or deserved it in the first place. It's why humility is something that we desperately need, not simply just for mental health or because it helps us improve certain life skills that we use in our life. I mean, it's true, it does that, but because humility helps us become better Christians who are able to properly serve God and help others receive the same understanding that we need. I mean, without humility, we're back to how the Pharisees acted before Jesus came to set the record straight, told them that they were wrong to think this way, and showed us how we are actually supposed to act, how we are supposed to think, how we're supposed to believe. That is what this passage is telling us on how we should be as children of God. Humility and the desire to want people to come to God is something that we should desire so that we can properly serve God throughout our life. Remember, we were all like them once and could have still been them before we came to God. Just like children's stories with heavy topics, we also need to use our humility to take the time to figure out how to explain the gospel in a way that they're able to understand it, and to not be frustrated when they don't immediately understand what you're saying. It will take time, and there will be difficulties along the way, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try or feel discouraged when people don't believe. I mean, Jesus never took what people would assume to be the easy way out, and we shouldn't either when it comes to spreading the word of God. So with that in mind, always remember his love for us and let them come to him. Let us pray.